All right, chat. There's a video I wanted to check out called Urban Planning for Leftists. Yeah, I know. I started watching Not Just Bikes. I started watching all sorts of other content first that eventually went on and ended up being major pieces of content for other people. No big deal. But we're going to try this one out because this is actually something that I really believe in. Municipal government for the left. Like, there's a lot of leftists who think that being on the left is literally like, oh, all right, one day we'll have a big rupture and everything will get fixed. I'm a little bit more down, my feet firmly planted on the ground. I want public housing. I want parks. I want things to happen and change now. Sewer socialism. That's right.
Twitter. Yikes. Why did I get back on this wasteland? It's not as bad as TikTok, but at least TikTok can claim that it's just a children's app. Urbanism Twitter, an unholy matrimony of the transit and housing circles, is a dark place. I understand the YIMBY rhetoric. I made a whole video about it after all, but I'm honestly bummed out by how many supposed leftists follow this same logic. Any leftist should agree that if your end goal is to preserve the existing system, you're a centrist at best. Leftism is a struggle to break free from capitalism. So follow my logic here. If a policy claims to solve an existing problem by preserving capitalism decades into the future, is it compatible with leftist ideologies?
And I agree with him 100%. Like, if your policy is, say, a TIF to, provide a tax break for a private developer, then yeah, you're not really doing leftism. Now, there's two different ways of looking at things. You can look at things from a kind of structural change and a short-term utilitarian lens of reduction of harm. And I think reducing harm is good. I do think reducing harm is good. But as far as being a left-winger, you should be coming up with structural change. It's tax increment financing, Cisco. It basically refers to, it's a system where a developer doesn't have to pay the increased value of property in their property tax assessment. So let's say that you have a blank piece of land in the city and I want to build an apartment building on it. Well, if I build an apartment building on that blank piece of land, the county tax assessor is going to stop by and say, well, that used to be $100 a year of property taxes when it was a blank piece of land, but now that it's an apartment building, it's $10,000 a year in property taxes. Or $100,000 a year in property taxes, right? Or $1 million a year in property taxes, right? Well, what a TIF is the government creates a special rule just for you, and they say, you'll get to keep paying property taxes like it's a blank piece of land. And if you do that, you could take that money, that $900,000 a year that you would owe, and you can use that to pay off your construction loans. But instead of the government like taking $1 million from you and then buying stuff, or the government taking taxes and building the housing themselves and then collecting rent from the tenants and actually having an asset that the community can borrow against, for example, they're going to give the private owner the $1 million of tax benefit because he built the thing. So everybody else in the community is now giving money to the property developer. He's basically a lord now, and you're his peasants. That's what a TIF is. It's feudalism with extra steps. No, because those private developers will not have affordable houses make. Here in KC, Missouri, they just voted to give tax breaks to a private developer as long as they made 20% affordable homes or units. Their definition of affordable, $1,200 a month for a one-bedroom. Yeah, they just build market rate units. And then some guy is now enriched who owns the property. You just made someone really rich with your tax dollars. Fucking genius. Building more houses reduces the price of housing. That's not really true. If you build an entire tower of, say, $10,000 a year high-end luxury units, guess what? Doesn't really lower the price of middle level units. It doesn't. It really doesn't. Keep going.
No, it's not. Now, leftists seem to get this when it comes to healthcare and prisons and labor policies, but it really does fall apart when it comes to urban planning. I'm seeing far too many calls from socks and roses and sickles for urban deregulation, for the exchange of wealth and power from communities to the private market, and for endless growth in a world that's already reached its absolute limit. But I really don't blame any of these people for making these naive calls. There's very little to pull from in terms of contemporary leftist urban planning. In practice, leftist urban planning is an oxymoron. You cannot implement leftist spatial concepts if you are the spatial arm of a capitalist government. But there is also limited leftist planning theory today, and where it does exist, it's usually inaccessible for non-academics. Marxist class analysis is valid in the prison abolition, police abolition, healthcare, debt cancellation, and labor movements.
So this is really a question about, let me just, to build off what he's saying, maybe contradict it a little bit. If I take land from private hands through, say, expropriation, eminent domain, and then I build high quality social housing on that land, I raise the standard of living of the working class, and I take value away from the market. And with enough of those discrete actions, I can basically decommodify housing through that action, be it expropriation plus development. It's not, the market's going to fix it. That's ridiculous. I actually have to make that discrete decision. And I personally believe that if you have public owned facilities, that is a movement toward the left as opposed to, some other alternative. Backertain, thank you for the tier 1.
While this renaissance hit the field of human geography, its obnoxious cousin, urban planning, has so far avoided any mainstream incorporation of the Marxist framework. Some academics believe that we are on the onset of that renaissance, and I would agree, but it may be too soon to tell. We need to incorporate urban planning theory and practice into our leftist movement, but this is not something you can find in books like Walkable City or Street Fight or The New Urban Crisis or Happy City or Strong Towns or Arbitrary Lines. This is all pop planning. This is the status quo. This is using urban planning within its own boundaries. The only thing you could take away from pop planning is that urban planning is actually very flexible when wealth and power express their interests. It's important to be critical of urban planning as a leftist. It's important to be critical of everything as a leftist. There are many urbanists out there armed with piss-poor data analysis that will have you believe that the free market is the best provider of human needs. It is not. On the other hand, we have a government that solely supports the free market, so their own actions too need to be examined critically. I don't want to defeat you, but isn't a little defeat better than a blind faith in a failed system? The most important thing right now to understand is that the needs and goals of the working class contradict the needs and goals of the capitalist class. The resulting mediator is urban planning. In this sense, urban planning is the tool to foster the endless growth that capitalism requires with minimal disruption. This is the critical lens that I use to analyze urban planning, and it's been thoroughly fleshed out by radical planners. The last time that leftist thought, especially Marxist thought, was widely incorporated into urban planning was in the 1970s and 80s. These theorists fall under the umbrella known today as radical planning. The earliest radical planners were concerned with the question of what planning is, rather than what planning ought to be. Radical planners were interested in defining how any era of planning is a manifestation of the dominant political ideology of its respective time. This is what planning is. This is contrasted with theories of that time that focused on things that planning should achieve and how it could go about achieving them. This is what planning ought to be. Radical planners use the concept of the Kapitalstaat, has anybody ever said this out loud? The Kapitali state, or capitalist state, to define the government's role of preserving capitalism. Capitalist theory would have you believe that laissez-faire policies, that is, an approach where the government makes minimal or no interventions, is viable and ideal actually, but this isn't true.
By the way, chat, we've seen this.
Have you believe that laissez-faire policies, that is, an approach where the
low wages, high rent. It's almost like we've had this problem before.
Minimal or no interventions is viable and ideal actually, but this isn't true. Capitalism collapses constantly. Its own nature is to destroy itself and everything around it. The state, that is the government, has evolved to use its regulatory powers and tax revenue solely to remove the hindrances to economic growth. In this support, it legitimizes the system and preserves its dominance over all alternatives. This is the Kapitali state. When the Kapitali state is functioning spatially, we call it urban planning. Radical theorists A.J. Scott and S.T. Roweis explain it like this. Capitalist society is, in fact, ever ready to implode in upon itself, and is indeed innately self-destructive. Hence, in the absence of any agency capable of maintaining social balance and cohesion, capitalist society would in fact rapidly disintegrate. However, it is precisely out of the intervening tension between the claimants of profits and the claimants of wages that the capitalist state progresses. So, how has urban planning been used to preserve capitalism? Scott and Roweis offer the following examples of major urban planning milestones and how they prevented capitalist collapse. As capitalists rapidly industrialized English cities in the first industrial revolution, the densely built living quarters combined with capitalist-caused water and air pollution led to massive deaths and lingering diseases among the working class needed to run the factories. Here, the capitalist desire for growth of polluting industry contradicted the working class desire to remain alive. Through street cleaning, the provision of clean water, and the creation of building codes, urban planners were able to halt the extinction of the urban working class and therefore prevent the collapse of industry. With this initial problem solved, capitalism continued to advance until the next collapse was imminent. Let's go to Paris in the mid-19th century. Napoleon III, wanting to keep up with the German states and England, constructed and consolidated a railroad network throughout France with connections to outside nations. The increased volume of imports forced French capitalists to become more competitive. This enabled massive commercial growth in Paris, bringing with it massive population growth as well. But with streets often too narrow for even a horse cart and a population density unsustainable for healthy living conditions, Paris's commercial growth became untenable. The capitalist desire here to sell goods at a higher volume contradicted with the working class desire to live a healthy life near employment opportunities. Napoleon III, through the purview of Baron Haussmann, demolished most of the medieval parts of the city and replaced them with wide avenues and large buildings to support commerce. The problem of moving goods to market was solved here.
Also, I will say this, that wide avenues are seen as harder to barricade. Paris was very frequently revolting. They're revolting. And barricades were a frequent feature of the left-wing working class uprisings. So when you create these really wide avenues and streets, make it more difficult to barricade and block.
Capitalism advanced to the next stage of urbanization. As capitalist developers constructed suburbia after World War II, there was a massive exodus from cities, mostly by white people. This led to high congestion as the new suburbanites still worked in the high-paying jobs in the urban core. The capitalist desire to continue building low-density, car-oriented suburbs contradicted the working class desire to work at high-paying urban jobs. This caused planners to construct expressway networks, demolishing huge swaths of predominantly black and low-income neighborhoods. If this intervention had never happened, the downtown businesses might have gone under or moved more readily outside of the city. The construction of expressways enabled downtown capitalists to continue profitable operations and move on to the next phase of urbanization. Through these examples, you should see that urban planning is in service to capitalism. Through regulation, the capitalist state is able to maintain property values and locational benefits for capitalists. The capitalist state is then able to use tax revenue from protected or increased property values to provide services, infrastructure, and subsidies to keep the ever-collapsing private market viable. Scott and Roweis were writing before.
I mean, dead on accurate. I mean, that's just true. We've bailed these people out time and time again. Most recently in 2008. This is a feature of capitalism: is it's constantly collapsing and unstable.
Start of neoliberalism, which is our current economic system. Things are much worse under neoliberalism than ever before.
One for all,
we can define neoliberalism using David Harvey's terms. Neoliberalism is a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework, characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. Neoliberalism embraces the capitalist state. It openly supports business interests over all else, even if its adherents still claim that the market is free. Neoliberalism
So I don't like the Harvey definition because I feel like the thing about neoliberalism that made it unique from liberalism is that the neoliberals concede that markets cannot exist without extensive government intervention. They just think the extensive government intervention should be in the favor of competition as a virtue. Competition uber alles. Bring competition into everything. Cooperation don't work. Just compete. Everybody's got to compete. And when the market and the competition fails, bail it out. No, don't have aspects of the economy that focused on cooperation. Don't have aspects of the economy or state provision that focus on government provision of services directly. Have everything be subcontracted. Have everything be separated from collective action. Privatize everything.
Liberalism is rooted in bonkers economics that minimize all market relations into simple supply and demand. Neoliberalism is directly responsible for increased poverty, homelessness, and income inequality. There are no benefits to working class people under neoliberal policy. And the worst part is, it is the dominant economic system across the world. As a tool of the state, urban planning itself is neoliberal. Its actions support the market first under the demonstrable
SLX, thanks
false
for the
belief
33
that
months,
the
bud.
benefits of development will trickle down to the working class. If you think of the examples that I listed before,
Red Wizard says they don't want competition. That is a farce. They want to benefit with them alone. Yeah, it's managed competition for the incumbent capitalists.
Massive dying off of the working class in industrial England, the difficulty of getting goods to market in railroad-age Paris, and the expressways in downtown America, they depict a capitalist-caused crisis and show an ultimate win for capitalism. It looks like our housing affordability crisis is setting the stage for the total collapse of capitalism today. With neoliberalism being arguably the least supportive capitalist state towards the working class, I'm starting to wonder if there will be an intervention at all. All signs point to no, and when a capitalist state loses its ability to support capitalism, it has historically resorted to fascism. So why did I make this one? Well, sure. I do fantasize about taking my own profession down, and I think many burnout planners do as well. But more than that, I've come to realize the importance planning plays in a leftist movement. I think people who fight for radical changes like public housing, rent control, and neighborhood equity get this already, but I would say that most people do not. I think this quote sums it up a lot better than I could. Planning practices that are built upon Marxism are surely impossible without changes outside of the sphere of planning, but also vice versa. Major social, political, and economic transformations that will prevent climate change and challenge the logic of capitalism are impossible without reorganizing landscapes and producing new spaces.
Let me give you a concrete example. If you're like listening to this and be like, Mike, this is kind of like, this is a little bit too theory dense for me. This is a little bit boring. I don't know what you mean. I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, I became mayor of a major city. And I said, what I want to do is fix that homelessness and housing crisis. That's numero uno for Mike from PA. By the end of my decade in office, I will end homelessness and I will end the housing crisis. What would I do? What would I do? Well, I would take land. I would build upon that land. I would hold that land and those developed properties as assets for the city. I would have people move in, they would pay less rent, and I would continually be building those spaces. And those spaces that I would build, what would I build them as? I would build them as sustainably as possible. I would have on them, they would be, you know, as close to a zero impact house as possible, or buildings, you know what I mean? Like the apartment building would generate solar energy. It would be highly efficient in its heating and cooling systems. And it would, you know, for example, I would build what we call community solar. This undermines the energy market. If the housing I'm producing is actually net energy positive, meaning it starts generating electricity to sell to other people, I am now running a state-run utility as well. Now the electricity market and the energy market is being taken away from capitalists. We are building a totally different way of changing the housing situation. And when I have that utility, when I have that electricity generating, when I have those property building and providing public housing, I am changing the physical space that people occupy in their day-to-day lives. That is how it's done. And now we are changing away from what amounts to allow selected individuals to rule over a city as pseudo lords, as kings, being given tithes from the population in exchange for promising to build something. Maybe you could take lands within city limits, but usually most already taken. I'm taking it from people who already have it. Mike seems to imply forcible expropriation without compensation. Whatever, we could compensate if we want. I don't give a shit. A lot of places have blighted land anyway. How do you deal with the private actors already providing electricity that charge you fees to utilize their grid? One of the biggest preventers of going solar to regulate people are the fees and contracts involved with net metering with individual energy producers. Those are usually state-guaranteed utilities. Nationalize them. Nationalize the electric utility within my city. It's been done before. It's been done before in America.
Urban planning is as much the reason for our current struggles as it is the way we can get out of them. We must incorporate leftist urban planning ideals into our movement and reject neoliberal ones. Just like everything else, urban planning will remain a part of capitalism until we successfully demand that it serve the people over capital. This requires a critical eye. We need to be more critical of urbanist movements, and we need to look at everything comprehensively, not just issue to
But do you see what I'm saying? Like when you build that public housing and then all of a sudden it has community solar project associated with it, right? And then it starts producing energy and you've taken housing out of the market and you've begun to undermine the electrical generation market how does the revenue of the community solar project distributed? It's distributed back to the people, or it's used back directly for the people for whom are consuming that solar energy. So now they don't have electricity bills. They're actually making per person money on the generation of electricity. And because it's solar, we don't rely on foreign fucking sources of fuel. And suddenly everything is being taken out and then things are being distributed for the collective benefit. And then suddenly, because we are creating these net zero homes, we're creating these solar energy projects, suddenly we're addressing climate change at the same time. And then because we're building more dense, we're building these public housing properties, suddenly public transit is easier to build and makes more sense. There's more riders, and we're shifting people from car transit and bus transit to electric trams and trains and subways. And everything is feeding on itself. And that means you're undermining the private transport market. All those things, they compound on each other, then compound and compound. Everything you do brings more energy, more wealth for the decommodification of all those industries. And you are much better off. Your finances as a city improve as the number of services increase. And then suddenly, because you have so many people living in affordable housing with low cost energy, now more people want to have commercial opportunities. This is how socialists are even better at capitalism than capitalists. Your city will attract more young people. Your city will attract more people just interested in having a higher quality of life. That is what you do. Pollution improves because less people are in cars. That means less money is spent on healthcare. That means people live longer lives. Everything gets built on itself, and it builds on itself. And you started out with one project. Let's build that public housing. And then suddenly, everything's trending in the right way. Sort of like when we took and we destroyed our cities and moved them out to the suburbs and gave land to developers. Everything went the wrong way for generations. When you build it the right way, it all cascades. So many of the issues in urban planning come from a balanced lack of centralized authority, all competing for the jurisdiction authority to build out their projects. Funkadelic is exactly right. The reason why America sucks is because there's not enough authority to do the smart thing. You said, what did you say? Balkanized? Balkanized. Thank you. Yeah, I know what you meant.
Issue. Any movement that proposes that the private market will be able to solve our problems, like housing or transit or climate change, are simply not worth your energy. These movements will cement capitalism's hold on our society deep into the future, and our governments will continue to throw our tax revenue to support these absolute failures. If we give more power to the people who are causing these social ills, they are not going to use that power to improve the situation. So between some guy who wants to upzone every piece of land in an already dense city and the BIPOC residents that are resisting displacement, leftists should probably side with the BIPOC residents, right? Send tweet.
That was like he tweeted out of Auschwitz. I can't believe you're saying don't vote for liberals. Is there any way to anticipate the capitalist reaction to this? Maybe I'm paranoid, but my thoughts fly toward drastic lawcraft. I mean, that's why you need somebody who's going to say, fuck your laws, fuck your capitalist bullshit. What did FDR do? I'm going to add 9 new justices. Are you watching the stream unsubbed? You're making income inequality worse. You are doing anti-praxis. We are the only Twitch stream that will not accept scam advertisers, and I will never fuck you over by selling you crap.